Welcome back everyone, it's me Matt, thanks for joining me today. We're talking about the US Army's brand new M10 Booker light tank that has just been cancelled. A stunning decision, in my opinion, that pulls the plug on a program barely a year into its service. And if you're a military enthusiast like me, you've probably seen many shiny photos and videos of this so-called light tank rolling out, and we all thought it was going to be the Army's next best thing. Well, clearly it's not.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
No, Andy! No, Andy, no!
But in all seriousness, I am actually quite sad and disappointed that the Booker did not come to fruition within the US military. I do believe it had a lot of capability, but clearly not the capabilities that the US Army was looking for. But let's get into a deep dive of this vehicle. But before we do, I want to give a huge shout out to Army and Outdoors, today's video sponsors. They've been my go-to for all kinds of genuine Army surplus gear, things that stand the test of time and are just as good as they are old as they are new, unlike the Booker. And these guys have about 30 years of experience, and you can really tell from their massive range of products on their website. They stock legit surplus items from all over the world, including popular German surplus pieces. I'm a personal preference of Flecktarn, and my order actually arrived in just 5 business days. It is the fastest business I've ever dealt with when getting surplus items of this kind. Plus, you can get 10% off your first order with my code Matsimus. Just click the link in the video description or head directly to armyandoutdoors.com/Matsimus to grab your discount. So even if you're not actually looking for anything, just go check out the website. Never know what you'll find on that store. There's all sorts of unique little items. They even have a one-offs page, which I really like, to find those unique items that you're just not going to be able to find in certain Army surplus stores in your local area. And again, if you are supporting this channel with purchase through that 10% discount, I really appreciate it. And once again, thanks again to Army and Outdoors for supporting today's video. Okay, so back to the M10 Booker. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It was the latest chapter of the US Army's decades-long quest for a viable light tank. Going back to the Cold War, the Army experimented with vehicles like the M551 Sheridan in the late 1960s, an air-droppable 19-ton light tank that proved infamous for its thin armor and troublesome gun missile system. The Sheridan was retired by the 1990s, leaving airborne and light infantry units really without a dedicated armored punch. But did it really need it? Well, in the mid-1990s, the Army developed the M8 armoured gun system as the Sheridan replacement, though. A promising light tank project that was cancelled again in 1997. As the post-Cold War budget axe fell, fast forward to the 2000s, and the Army tried again by mounting a 105mm gun on the Striker vehicle or the mobile gun system. That stopgap has served in the Striker brigades for quite some time, but it was too slated for retirement by 2022 due to obsolescence and some mechanical issues. Although I must admit I have a lot of respect for the Striker vehicles in the MGS. Seeing a 105mm empty case punching out the back of that thing is always super sexy. But in short, the Army has long recognised a gap in providing infantry with mobile firepower and repeatedly struggled to fill it. By the 2010s, the lessons learned with the Iraq-Afghanistan war and a rising focus on high-intensity warfare, the Army renewed its interest in a lighter tank. In 2015, it launched the Mobile Protected Firepower, or MPF program, essentially a contest to give infantry brigade combat teams a pocket tank for direct fire support. 2 competitors emerged, one from BAE Systems, the best one. Sorry, I'm only saying that because General Dynamics Land Systems never listens to any of my messages if they want to actually have me come visit them. I'm just kidding. I have a huge respect for BAE Systems, of course. But General Dynamics did win the contract in June 2022 to build the first batch of vehicles. The Army was clearly eager, and this would be the first new combat tank-like vehicle that would support and be developed since the 1980s. And of course, they gave it a name steeped in heritage. The vehicle was officially designated the M10 Booker, honouring 2 American war heroes, one from World War II and one from Iraq. All signs pointed the Army to finally getting a light tank that had been chasing for so long. But of course, the road was very bumpy. So what exactly was the M10 Booker? In Army lingo, it's actually called a tank at no point, rather a mobile protected firepower vehicle, basically an assault gun on tracks meant to support infantry with direct fire. It was never classified as a tank, which is why so many YouTube channels have poised it as looking at not being one. Think of it as a modern take on World War II concepts, an armoured vehicle with a big gun that tags along with foot soldiers to blast enemy bunkers, machine gun nests, or light armoured threats. Now, on paper, we have to all admit it did look quite formidable with a 105mm M35 cannon, the same caliber used as the early model Abrams, mounted in a fully traversing turret, a coaxial 7.62 machine gun, a 50 caliber machine gun on top with advanced optics, and had a crew of 4 and was built on a track chassis with a modern armoured protection system, though notably thinner of course than main battle tanks. By 2023, prototypes were out and even doing live demonstrations, impressing onlookers as the 105mm gun thundered during the dedication ceremony at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The vehicle posted a top speed of around 40 miles per hour and a lot of modern targeting systems. At last it seemed like the army had found its brawler to accompany its troops alongside where the M1 Abrams just couldn't go. Earlier army plans called for buying about 500 of these vehicles, enough to give each infantry brigade a company of around 14 vehicles. The vision was clear: parachute these into a hotspot to roll off a transport of some kind and just give light fighters some serious muscle. But the funny thing happened on the way to fulfilling that vision. That's where the trouble begins. For a vehicle that was supposed to be light and air mobile, the M10 Booker turned out to be surprisingly heavy, and that proved to be its Achilles heel. Originally, the army brass wanted a tank that could be dropped by a parachute via a C-130 Hercules, just like the old Sheridan. However, as the design evolved, the Booker packed on the pounds just like I am. Additional armour to survive on the modern battlefields, bigger engines and other requirements inflated its weight to around 38 to 42 tons by the time it hit production. To put that into perspective, that's as heavy as a Cold War era T-72 main battle tank, and even more than the classic World War II Sherman. Not exactly the petite air-dropped vehicle that the army had in mind, in fact a 42-ton combat-loaded vehicle. Nothing in that size could fit in the 130. The army quietly dropped the C-130 airdrop requirement early on, hoping no one would notice, but the problems didn't stop there. Even the larger C-17 transport, which the army hoped could carry 2 Bookers at once, struggled with the Booker's bulk. In reality, that weight meant that the C-17 could only carry 1 Booker per flight, of course with some extra equipment, but you want 2 on there. So much for a flying platoon in quickly with these vehicles, and forget airdropping the Booker from C-17 with parachutes. That idea was a non-starter once the vehicle tipped the scales over the safety limit. The British military term light tank famously once meant something like 8 to 10 ton Scorpion recon tanks of the CVRT platforms, but the contrast of light with the Booker was pushing that 40-ton limit was not light. This led to almost absurd situations when the 101st Airborne, an infantry unit of course, prepared to receive Bookers, planned on discovering that 8 of the 10 bridges at Fort Campbell would literally crack under its weight. Imagine the infantry as they go across bridges and saying, you know what, we should bring our tanks. We might as well just bring an Abrams at that point, because that's what the Booker had become. It was a classic case of requirements creep, and this happens on a lot of programs, not just military programs, civilian applications too. I deal with them as my job, and they each add capability that does make it a better armoured vehicle, but is a lot less deployable. But of course, the hammer came down in May 2025 as the US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth issued a sweeping memorandum on Army transformation, calling on the service to divest outdated, redundant and inefficient programs. The M10 Booker was squarely in the crosshairs. Just hours after unveiling a massive shakeup of Army modernization, officials confirmed that the M10 Booker program was cancelled. The Army Secretary Dan Driscoll didn't sugarcoat it when speaking to reporters. "We got the Booker wrong." Driscoll admitted bluntly, and I have to admit, listening to that is probably a brutal pill to swallow. You know, the Booker is certainly on paper something that makes sense, in my opinion, for the infantry, but it just wasn't able to be designed in that way. But what I really respect out of this is, rather than pouring more money into a misfit, Army leaders chose to cut their losses. Quote, "We made a mistake, we're going to stop, we're going to own it." Unquote. Driscoll recounted of telling the Pentagon leadership of this particular statement, and it's a remarkable moment of candor, I think, in the military procurement system, which you don't see very often. From the Pentagon's perspective, cancelling the Booker is part of a larger pivot. Defense Secretary Hegseth's guidance is all about focusing on high-tech capabilities, things like long-range missiles, drones, and cyber defense, while trimming the, quote, legacy fat. The Army wants to avoid the classic scenario of a program that moves so slowly it's outdated by the time it reaches the field. Bradley. I'm just kidding, I love the Bradley. And in many ways, the Booker was already feeling a bit like a throwback to an early era of warfare. Big gun, heavy armor, in a time where drones and smart weapons are becoming more popular. By cancelling it, the Army could free up some resources for priorities more aligned with modern threats. Of course, this decision also leaves that continuous gap. Those light infantry units still lack a dedicated armoured support vehicle, at least for now, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But the official rationale was clear: the Booker was square peg and a round hole for the future battlefield. Now, as a tank mechanic myself, one of the more eye-opening revelations in the Booker saga was the, quote, right to repair, unquote, controversy. It turned out the Army had signed a maintenance contract for the M10 Booker that severely limited the Army's own mechanics from even fixing it. Essentially, General Dynamics had to be the only one to service many of the parts, even things the Army units felt they could handle themselves. This is like buying a car, Tesla, but agreeing that only the dealer can change the oil or even the wiper blades. Army leaders and lawmakers were not happy when they discovered this. Senator Elizabeth Warren was particularly vocal as a critic, slamming the Booker's restrictive maintenance terms for leading to, quote, higher prices for DIOD and for longer wait times, unquote, for repairs. In an interesting January confirmation hearing, Warren grilled Army leadership on why they'd sign away the ability of soldiers to 3D print or locally manufacture simple parts. Driscoll himself later lamented that this was sinful to harm our soldiers by conceding so much to a private industry in those contracts. You can imagine the Pentagon's frustration not only when the Booker was heavy and too hard to deploy, but it also came with strings attached that could slow down wartime repairs and jack up costs. For an army trying to become more agile and self-sufficient, this was a massive red flag. And speaking of costs, the Booker program carried a hefty price tag. Officially, the plan was to spend over $17 billion to procure the full fleet of roughly 500 vehicles, and as of the cancellation, about $7.2 billion had already been spent. That's a lot of taxpayer money on a light tank that was increasingly looking like a very bad investment. Now, we can debate whether or not it was wise to cut losses or continue sinking more money into it, but the Pentagon leaders, of course, felt that the remaining $10 billion was going to be needed somewhere else. And Mr. Hegseth's memo wasn't just about one vehicle, though. It was about shaking up how the Army buys equipment overall. The Booker became a poster child for what they didn't want to happen. A program with runaway requirements, vendor lock-in maintenances, and a lukewarm support from the field. In the end, the numbers in the fine print were just not in the Booker's favour. And it's really sad. But the big question is, what do you do when a brand new combat vehicle is cancelled so short forth? Well, the question that's been facing the Army and General Dynamics land systems is still being answered to this day. By all accounts, GDLS has already produced around 80 Bookers and delivered them to the Army. These were low-rate initial production units meant for testing and for the first few brigades. Now, with the program axed, those 80 vehicles are kind of in limbo. The Army no longer has a plan or budget to use them as originally intended. Some might end up in storage depots or training centres or be divvied out experimentally to see if they can find a niche for them. It's even possible a few could be offered to allied nations for evaluation through a selling cancelled system program, but a bit of a tough pitch in my opinion. For GDLS, the cancellation means that the anticipated production of hundreds of Bookers, of course, won't happen, which is a big financial hit for them. The company does have still other big programs, though. They make the Abrams tank upgrades and Stryker vehicles, for instance, but losing a $17 billion program is never good news for the bottom line. There's also the human aspect. Workers who ramped up and were set up and probably pretty excited for Booker production will, of course, potentially face layoffs or reassignment. And it is reminiscent of other defense industry letdowns, but GDLS at least saw this coming a little bit as rumors swirled, and they likely didn't expand too aggressively beyond those initial 96 units under contract. On the Army side, the immediate impact, of course, is on the infantry brigade combat teams that were slated to receive the Booker. Units like the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne were among the first in line. Now, those units remain without an organic armoured fire support vehicle. That could be a bit of a concern, and remember, one reason the Booker was conceived was the light infantry had historically struggled against enemies holed up in bunkers or behind walls. Without the Booker's 105mm gun, those IBCTs will rely things on missiles, javelins, mortar fire, and calling in air support, of course, to fill the gap. But, as we know, they are very long-winded when it comes to mass ordering of that equipment, and they're also very expensive. Now, it's not an impossible situation, after all, they've managed it before, but it does underscore a capability, a gap, that will still exist in the US Army. And a big reason as well, though, for the M10 Booker's cancellation isn't as shocking as it sounds, is the changing face of warfare. Simply put, the age of drones, smart weapons, and networked warfare is definitely here, and it's forcing the Army, and every Army, I think, to rethink the type of weapons it needs. In recent conflicts, of course, looking at the war in Ukraine, for example, we've seen even top-tier tanks getting zapped by cheap kamikaze drones and top-attack missiles. A slow, loud, armoured vehicle can be tempting as a target for a $1,000 drone, dropping grenades attached to infantry sections. Army Secretary Driscoll and others have openly said that the service is pivoting to invest in that new tech. Quote, "We are infusing infantry units with drones, autonomous systems, robots," unquote. And the Army's top general is emphasizing that aim with field unmanned systems to counter drone all gear across all divisions. And of course, being a very conventional tool, the Booker was a little bit doomed from the start. And as much as I am sad, I'm really not surprised, and strategically, few analysts I think were shocked when the Booker got cut. The writing was on the wall. Modern peer conflict scenarios and technology trends just don't favour a system like this. The Army is doubling down on a peace through strength via tech, investing in cyber, AI, long-range fires, drones, and while trimming the fat of yesterday's solutions, and everyone kind of saw it coming. Now, on a positive note, one could applaud the Army for actually having the courage to say, "Stop it, this is not working," and as Driscoll said, historically they might have kept buying it for years and realising that they made a huge mistake and need to stop. This time they cut the bait early, potentially saving a lot of money and, even more seriously, lives in the long run. And for us enthusiasts, it's a bit sad to see a new tank. Let's be honest, we all like new tanks getting shelved, even though it's not a tank, military vehicle, so to speak. But it's also a reality check that military equipment has to earn its keep in the modern day real world. It's not just look cool on paper and the kind of Cold War era spend and hope for the best. And with that, we close the chapter on the Booker, leaving behind a lot of lessons for the next generation of Army programs. And let's hope we do learn some lessons. It's a lot of money, of taxpayers' money being pushed around, and I'm not saying or speaking on behalf of the American taxpayer, but it is still money that you will probably never really see come back into a need that is going to make a lot of value added. For instance, those vehicles that are already still being used, as I said, who knows what they're going to do with them. So to conclude, modern military tech is a fast-moving game, and it is a game, even when the Army isn't afraid to pull the plug on a project that doesn't fit the bill. Personally, I think admitting a mistake and course-correcting is a true sign of quite smart leadership, even if it's a little bit embarrassing. Infantry units might be disappointed to lose these promised vehicles, but they'll adapt and find other tools until something better comes along. If I know anything better than many things in the US military, the US infantry is going to be able to do exactly what they need to do with what they have. Meanwhile, though, the Army will of course push forward on drones, missiles, and yes, probably other armoured vehicles that hopefully will learn from the Booker's fate. But what do you think about the M10 Booker's cancellation? Was it an obvious call, or do you believe the Army is giving up on something important? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to join the discussion in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the ups and downs, give it a thumbs up, please. It really helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe for more military tech breakdowns and defense news analysis. I've got plenty more in store, from tank tactics to the latest in drone warfare. As always, thank you so much for watching and spending your time with me. All the best, folks. Bye-bye.